Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today I'm doing my recap for week 23 of the Overwatch League. I did not have a video up last week doing a recap, obviously with Overwatch 2. There's also some personal stuff that came up. I planned on doing it, but I just had too much stuff come up that I couldn't really get a video out last week. So I did do a little Twitter thread last week if you wanted to check that out. I'll link it in the description just to see it if there's anything you want to know you're curious about. Obviously it's not as relevant anymore because we had another week of play, but in case you wanted to see it, I'll just link it in the description. Today I'm not going to talk about every match. I'm just going to kind of do a little bit more deep dives into the bigger matches of the weekend and talk about those and talk about some of the big teams because the reality is that some of the teams are out now and I don't really feel like talking about them as much because they don't really have the same weight, and that way I can spend a little more time on some of the other matches that happened. So let's just pull up the picks real quick so you can see them and we can go over them. Overall record this past week was 10-6, which is pretty good, but once again I went 1-1 in big picks, which means I cannot go positive with big picks this year, which is unfortunate because that's usually where I aim to do the best. But it's been a tough season of picks. It's been a much more difficult season than most. We'll have a more accurate number, make sure we have the full accurate picks and whatnot after next week. Sometimes I miss some games, sometimes there's a couple things that I mess up and make mistakes on, so I'll make sure to get that updated for next week fully. But you can see how I did. Obviously 10-6 overall, pretty good. Some teams definitely came to play in ways that I didn't really expect. The Shanghai Dragons came back, which was good. We finally saw them play well again. The Hangzhou Spark got a win over the Seoul Dynasty, which is definitely a surprise. And yeah, so let's just dive in and let's talk about the big matches from this past weekend. Start with the Hangzhou Spark Seoul Dynasty game. Hangzhou Spark have looked pretty weak all season, or at least this second half of the season. I believe that they, in the second half of the season, are like a one... I guess they're like a 2-win team in the second half of the season so far. And I feel like it's been very, very interesting to watch this team because sometimes they look pretty good and they're able to get wins like this, but they're very inconsistent now. They did a lot of stuff, and I don't know exactly why their roster went from being one of the best in the APAC region to arguably the worst in the APAC region very, very quickly. But a win over the Seoul Dynasty is nothing to scoff at. I don't know how much the Seoul Dynasty were putting into this game. I'm sure they were way more focused on the fact that they were going to have to play the Fusion in person. They've already locked up the #1 seed in the APAC region. There's a couple of things, of course, they could have gone for the #1 overall seed if they had won. They could have potentially gotten that #1 spot, but they did not. They end up as the #1 seed in APAC, but not the #1 overall team in the whole league. So it was an interesting game. I think the fact that the Spark won, it was almost a reverse sweep. The Dynasty had to, they won 2 maps, maps 3 and 4, but then lost the 5th map. I don't think the Spark really have anything to show that's very impressive. This is a good win. I'm not going to throw that out there, but I still don't feel great about them going into the play-ins because they are in the play-ins. They're not a playoff automatic team. So to me, it's a very, 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 very tenuous and rough spot for the Spark, who I just don't think look very good. And I don't feel like they are in a great position as we head into the final few games of the season for the APAC region in the play-ins. I just don't really think they're in a great spot. But speaking of the APAC region, the big pick for the APAC region this week was the Guangzhou Charge versus the LA Valiant. The winner of this game would lock in their spot, or not necessarily lock in their spot, but the winner of this game would put themselves in prime position to make it to the play-in tournament. And the winner was, of course, the Guangzhou Charge. Now, the Guangzhou Charge were in the very, very, very good position of win and in. If they won at all, they were going to make it to the play-ins. The Valiant would have had to win this game and then also win their next game. So it was a little bit more difficult for the Valiant to get in, but it didn't really matter at the end of the day because the Charge won. The Charge were victorious. The Charge looked really, really good. I'm really happy with what we've seen from the Charge so far in this latter half of the season. I've been very impressed by their overall level of play, their consistency as a team. I think they look very, very good. I think Jimmy has been one of the surprising players so far because I don't think people expected Jimmy to be as good as he's been, considering he was basically he rode the bench last year for Chengdu. Aprito, such a hyped up player coming into the league, was supposed to be on Chengdu, got cut from Chengdu, and then ended up here. And I think everyone thought that he would be the guy starting. And nope, we just seen a lot of Jimmy, and Jimmy looks really, really good. Choi Se-won looks good. Xerneas, I think, looks incredible. I think Xerneas is one of the best main supports in the league right now. I think he still looks really, really good, and he looks incredible. And I think that there's a lot of reason to think this Guangzhou Charge roster is going to do well in this play-in tournament. I think they are in a very good position to make the playoffs. I think they look really good, and I think that they're a team that I would expect to see do well when all is said and done in this playoff play-in whole scenario. For the Valiant, it stings to see their season end. I think they've been a better team for, honestly, a bit than a lot of the other teams in the APAC region. Like, I feel better about them than I feel about the Spark. I think they've played better recently than the Hunters, but they were just too inconsistent early on in the year. And, you know, they didn't have a great... You know, they won one game in the first tournament, just like the Charge did. But they were too inconsistent. They lost games to some other teams, and they were definitely on the weaker end of teams in this region. But they were really struggling to get those big wins. I don't think they beat the Dynasty once this year. They did beat the Dragons, I think, once this year. I could be wrong. But they struggled to get a lot of those big wins against those really good teams. From the Charge, at least were able to do. The Charge beat the Dragons. I don't think they beat the Dynasty either. But it's one of those things where they just haven't had the level of results that you want from a team to make the play-ins, even though I think they've been better than Chengdu and Spark recently. I just think that they didn't have enough in their tank early in the season to get there, and so they missed out, which, like I said, is unfortunate because I really liked watching the Valiant play late in the season. I thought they were a really fun team. If in a world where they could have both made the play-ins, I would have been really, really happy because I think they've been playing better than Chengdu, and I would have much rather seen them than the Spark. I think the Spark are not going to be very good, but hey, maybe the Spark will surprise me next week. We'll see. But unfortunate end of the season for the Valiant, but I'm excited for more Charge because I think they look really, really good. NA on Friday, Houston Owls beat the Paris Turtle to be expected. Washington Justice did beat the Boston Uprising, which is a bit of a surprise to me. I thought that the Justice were not looking as good as the Uprising were. The Uprising looked to be a pretty good team. Punk was playing well. It was close as a 3-2 game that the Justice won, but I think the Justice are an interesting spot because I think they're a good team. I really do think they're a solid team. I don't think they're a bad team by any means. I actually think them kind of moving their roster down to 5 is really interesting because I think it has helped them become more set in their identity. They know who they are better. They know what they are better. And I think it's really interesting to watch them as a team play because I think they are not as flexible as some of the other teams are. But I think that they know what they do well and they play into those strengths really well. And I think that they have begun to embrace that more. And I think they've arguably done better since they got rid of Mag and Happy and Vigilante than they were before they had those players. I just feel like they've looked more consistent. They've looked more put together. I feel like they don't disappoint as much. Maybe because the expectations on them are a lot lower now. But to me, they play above the expectations I have for them now that they've made their changes to their roster, and that's pretty good. And I think that's one of the things that's exciting to see. For the Boston Uprising, you know, they looked really, really good their first weekend of play, so I'm not surprised that they kind of came back down to earth. They had to play the Justice, they played the Gladiators. Those are good opponents. You know, it's tough to get wins over some of those teams, but I think that the Uprising still look pretty good. Like, they're in the play-ins, and they should be in the play-ins. I think they've looked better than Vancouver and New York and Paris all season, so there's no reason why they shouldn't be in the play-ins. You know, it's not like the APAC region where I think that the Valiant are more deserving than some of the teams there right now. In terms of how they're playing right now, and the Uprising are playing better than the other teams in this region, so it makes sense for them to get in. So good on them. I want to real quick just talk about the Florida Mayhem Vancouver Titans game. It was a close one. Mayhem reverse sweep the Titans, which the Mayhem seemed to love doing reverse sweeps. But I came to the realization while I was watching this game that I think the Florida Mayhem are my least favorite team to watch this season. I just don't like the way they play. I feel like it's really sloppy. and it's really dirty, and it's not very well put together, and it just involves a lot of like feeding and lack of coordination. Someone goes in and he dies, and Sir Majed goes in, on a uber flank and he dies, and then you have just all of this just super sloppy play that sometimes works for them, but also a lot of times doesn't work for them, right? They have slid down the standings quite a bit since the beginning of the season, and right now they're sitting in 9th. Now they're at 13 points, they're the same as the Justice. If they win one game, they'll pass the Justice. It's not the big a deal, but I don't really like the way the Mayhem play. I've really come to that realization the more I've watched them, that I just think this team is not very good. I don't enjoy watching them. I think they're a really frustrating team to watch. Seeing them beat the Titans honestly made me annoyed because I really just wanted that series to end. And the Mayhem came back and won, which good on them for doing that. I think that they're not a team that I think is bad in the sense of like they're going to lose games. Like they will fight. They are a team that is fighting them. They will come back from games that seems like they're going to lose. And they will fight their way back and win them. And that is something that I think is really impressive about this team because of how sloppy I think their play is. I still don't enjoy watching them, but I think it's impressive what they're able to do from a standpoint of they struggle sometimes to get to hit those highs, but they will claw themselves back from defeat in a lot of different scenarios. So I think that is impressive from the Mayhem, but I really just don't find this team enjoyable to watch. I don't like what they've done composition-wise, but I have to give respect to Gumba because I think he has really done a lot to bring this team together in a way that we haven't really seen from a lot of coaches recently, because I think a lot of coaches have had a little bit more either really poorly made rosters or like really good rosters, whereas I feel like this is a roster where it's talented and it needs a lot of work, and I think Gunba's done a lot to try to bring it together, which I think is very respectable. So I will give them respect for that, but I really just do not find this team entertaining to watch, and so we'll see what happens with them come the play-ins. Moving on, let's talk more about some of the APAC region. Saturday, Guangzhou Charge did beat the Hangzhou Spark, so like I said, like the Charge look better than the Spark right now. I think it's pretty obvious they're the better team right now, so no real surprises there. Shanghai Dragons were able to beat the LA Valiant. I predicted the Valiant to win just because I thought the Dragons were playing poorly. Obviously, they got their win last week against the Hangzhou Spark. They've bounced back this week, get a win over the Valiant, and they got a win over the Chengdu Hunters. So Dragons definitely are saving themselves from what was a pretty weak showing a couple of weeks ago. The problem, if you're the Shanghai Dragons, though, is that they lost too many games this tournament that they are now sitting behind the Fuel, Gladiators, Shock, and the Dynasty. So they're at their fifth seed, I believe, locked in for the overall standings. The Houston Outlaws can't catch them. They only have handful of games left. They're the team that is the closest behind them. So there's no real way for them to catch up. That's done. That's there's no real way for them to get there. So they're sitting behind a lot of these teams. They're not going to catch. No one's going to be able to catch them at this point in time. But you would have liked to see them perform a little bit better. I think they had struggles throughout this point in the season, but the 5 seed is the 5 seed. It's not the worst position to be in. It's the best of the rest, if you will. It's not a top 4 spot, but it's at least the best spot to be in the top 5, or not top 5. The best spot to be in outside the top 4. So they will have some control over what they're doing. They're going to get to play the weakest team that advances, whoever the 12 seed in the playoffs is. So they're in a pretty good spot. I think they're going to be fine, but it was nice to see them finally kind of recover after a bit of a slide. The first 3 games of this tournament cycle, they recovered well, and I think that is the good thing to see from the Dragons. Philadelphia Fusion also with a win over the Chengdu Hunters, their first win over the Hunters for the season. Very good on the Fusion. I talked about one of the things that I was concerned about the Fusion is that if they had to go into the play-ins, I was a little concerned about them because they'd been struggling against the Hunters this year. They'd struggled a bit against the Spark this year. The Charge been looking very good, and I thought the Fusion were looking a little shaky at times, especially in regular season matches. They were looked okay when tournaments came around, but in the regular season, they just did not look very good. But they beat the Hunters, which is a good win for them because they hadn't beaten them all season. That is a good, solid win for a team that needs it going into the playoffs. Get some of those big wins. Put yourselves in a good position to potentially make a run in the playoffs. I think they look really good. I think they're going to be a fun team to watch. Zest did get injured between this game and their second game, something with his hand. I don't know how serious it's going to be. They do have a bit of time before playoffs, so maybe it'll be better by the time playoffs comes around. But I think that would be a bit of an issue if they don't have Zest. I think they should be able to win if Zest is playing some more games. But without Zest, I think this team will be in a pretty rough spot. So I'm hoping he'll be back by the time playoffs comes around, but we will see what happens. Atlanta Reign beat the Florida Mayhem. I already said my piece about the Mayhem. Reign, I still think looks pretty good. I think them running a lot of Speedily and Venom is interesting. I don't think it's the best look that the team could have compositionally. I don't think it's really the meta. They're the only team really running Echo right now, so it's a little odd to see them doing it, but they continue to do it, and I think it works for them when it works. This is a really close series that I don't think necessarily should have been or could have been. I think we need to see more Kai. I think Kai really should be running Sojourn. I think Kai Venom is probably what they should be running more often, but they're opting to run Venom speedily, and we'll see what happens with them come playoffs. Gladiators going to win over Justice. Gladiators have bounced back incredibly from the Summer Showdown. They went 6-0 this tournament qualifier. They look like they could arguably be the best team in the region. I don't think people are putting them there because they haven't beaten anybody great. They didn't have to beat Dallas or San Francisco or Houston to get there. But they've had to win games, right? And they were tested by New York. They beat the Justice this week. They beat the Uprising this week. Two teams I think are pretty solid. They're not bad teams by any means. Last week they had wins over the Spitfire and the Excelsior, which was a close one against the Excelsior. And then in the very first weekend, they had wins over the Mayhem and the Titans. So not the most difficult tournament run for them, but they're the only team to go 6-0 in this qualifier across regions. No other team has 0 losses at all, so even teams that haven't finished yet can't go 6-0. So I think the Gladiators are in a very good spot. I don't think people should write off the Gladiators as much as they have. They had a bad Summer Showdown, even though they kind of bounced back towards the end. They played more space this weekend. Not a ton of space. They still played a lot of Reiner on the Zarya, but they did go with that off-tank look, and I think they looked a lot better this weekend. I think the Gladiators are in a very good spot, and I think that people are a little bit too low on them when I think that they look like they're in a really good spot going to playoffs, right? They're done for the qualifiers. They won all 6 games, did everything they needed to do. They've put themselves in a top 4 spot, potentially as the 3 seed, depending on what happens with the Shock, who I think will likely pass them, but we'll see obviously what happens. Chances are very high that the Shock pass the Gladiators. So I have to give a lot of credit to the Gladiators because they've looked very, very good so far this season. They've played well, and this tournament was a very good one for them. Houston Outlaws, Dallas Fuel, Battle for Texas was the big pick game that I got incorrectly because the Houston Outlaws were victorious in this one, in Dallas too. I think Houston looks like a very good team right now, and they got wins over the Shock and the Fuel in this qualifiers, which is really, really good for a team like Houston that has struggled in some of the big matches so far this season. They've struggled against some of the really good teams at times. They've struggled. They never felt like an elite level team because they were losing to the likes of the Gladiators and the Shock and the Fuel. But they got wins over the Shock and the Fuel. Their only loss this tournament was to the Boston Uprising the very first weekend, and they were running Doge, who was on ping, so that's probably the main reason why. They probably expected it to be a much easier game than it was. Things went awry, so definitely the thing that you kind of look at and gives you a bit of pause. But the Outlaws might be the best team in the West right now. I think the Gladiators going 6-0 is really, really good, and I think that they are one of the best teams. I think those are your top 3, would be the Outlaws, the Gladiators, and the Fuel. Maybe in that order, maybe not in that order, but I think those are the 3 best teams in the West right now. The Outlaws look really, really good. They're getting good at the right time. They're getting hot at the right time. I think they've looked really, really good. I think Pelican has had an incredible season, and I think should have been an MVP candidate. The fact that he isn't is kind of incredible because I think he has carried this team like to wins they probably shouldn't have had. because he just looked very, very good. So I'm happy with the Outlaws have done. I don't think the Fuel look bad by any means, but I think the Fuel are not a great team in front of a crowd. They were good in Toronto, and they were good in Dallas too for the first time. They just have not played well against the Outlaws on land, so maybe just the Outlaws are their kryptonite this year. But the Outlaws look pretty good, and I think they're a team to keep watching. Dragons beat the Hunters. Talked about that already. Dragons looking pretty good. Dynasty beat the Fusion on LAN. It was a very close series, even without Zest. The Fusion were able to put it to 5. It was, back and forth series that Dynasty were able to win. But both teams look pretty good. It was nice to see APAC matches on LAN again, because we haven't seen that in a very long time. We saw it last year a bit, but, that was in China. We haven't seen it in Korea. We haven't seen any LAN in a long time. So this was nice to see. I'm really happy with what we've seen so far, and I'm hoping that we get some more out of both these teams in the playoffs, because I'm really, really, really into the Dynasty and the Fusion. I think they both are really fun to watch. They're really good teams, and so we'll see what happens with them come the end of the season with the playoffs. Vancouver Titans beat the Paris Eternal. It was a pretty close series, but Titans were victorious in the end. Dallas Fuel beat the Atlanta Reign. Once again, Fuel looked good. They're a pretty solid team, but I don't think that this series was necessarily the best showing from Atlanta. It was a 3-1, so, kind of what you'd expect from these teams. I don't love what Atlanta does with not running a lot of Kai, especially against Dallas, where I think Hitscan is their bigger weak role. I think you have Kai on the Sojourn, and I think that really should elevate the Reign more, but they haven't opted to do it much. They're in the playoffs, so who cares if you're the Reign? You're already locked into the playoffs. You don't need to go into the play-in, so it is what it is, but I would have liked to see more Kai. I think that's really what the Reign should be focusing on. I think he is their best piece. I think without him, they don't look as good. But that's just me. And then the final match of the weekend was the LA Gladiators, 3-1 win over the Uprising. About what I'd expect. Gladiators looking pretty solid. Uprising looking okay. Pretty in line with what we've seen from them for most of the season. I just talked about the Atlanta Reign being in the playoffs. Let me just throw up the standings real quick. I'm going to see where things are right now, because there are only, all of the play-in spots are locked in. But now there is one automatic locked playoff spot up for grabs, and that is the 6th spot in the Western region. Now, seeding can change, of course, but in the West, the Fuel, Gladiators, Shock, Outlaws, and Reign are all locked in. Seeding is not. I think the Outlaws are locked in as the 4 seed in the West. That can't change. But the Gladiators are either the 2 or the 3, depending on what happens with the Shock. The Dallas Fuel are locked in for global number 1, which I don't necessarily agree with, because it's a whole thing about how tournament match wins are a part of your overall. It's something I don't really agree with, but that is what it is. That's just the way that the format works. I think it's bad, but, whatever. It is what it is. So there is some movement that can be had in there. The Shock and the Gladiators can switch. If the Spitfire win a game in the final stretch, they'll take that 6th seed, and they'll be ahead of the Reign. If the London Spitfire lose games and the Defiant win games, the Defiant can jump the Spitfire as the 6th seed, and that would be the Reign in 5. So there's obviously movement that can happen in the Western region, but the Fuel, Gladiator, Shock, Outlaws, Reign are locked in for the playoffs. While in the East, it's the Dynasty, the Dragons, and the Fusion locked in for the playoffs. And then the Spark, Charge, and Hunters in that order for the play-ins. So the Charge with the Hunters the first round, and then the winner of that will play the Spark. Obviously, Titans, Excelsior, Eternal, and Valiant eliminated from the season. They are no longer, after next weekend, we won't have any more Excelsior or Eternal. Titans and Valiant, their seasons are over as well already. And then next weekend will be our last matches for the APAC region. So Charge, Hunters, and Spark, 2 of those teams will have no more matches after next season, or after next week. So getting to the end, and we're getting close to the exciting playoffs time. But that's going to be all for today. Let me know your thoughts on anything I talked about in the video in the comments down below. Obviously, your support greatly appreciated, so if you enjoyed and want more like this in the future, consider liking and subscribing. But that's going to be all from me for today. Hope you are all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.